right, let's kick off. We are so glad that you are here. This is the conversation about the evolution of identity and development. We are going to spend the next hour talking about where the platforms are going in terms of integrating identity into your applications for B2C, B2B use cases, what Microsoft's doing with their B2C platform, how it's evolving, what the next steps are. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the details in terms of capabilities that they're bringing to the table. And we'll wrap it up by talking a little bit about some interesting decentralized identity capabilities that are sort of add-on to that. And as we get going, one thing I want you to be aware of is at the end of this presentation, there's going to be a little bit of information about what potential next steps look like. So make sure you fill out that form at the end. And then one thing that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the presentation today is assertively use that chat to ask questions. One of the things that's worked really well as we've had these webinars in the past is asking detailed questions within the chat. We have 4 people on this call today from Concurrency that know a lot about identity. So we're very well prepared to be able to answer questions. So as we go through it, put them there, ask away. We'll do our best to answer those questions as we're going on throughout the presentation. And if it's something that makes sense for us to address verbally in front of everyone, we will. Okay, so let's introduce the speakers who are here today. I'll start. I'm Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. Been in and around conversations regarding identity and development in our products that we're helping customers develop for some time. Been in consulting for 21 years. And am a Microsoft MVP in the Azure space. So super glad to be helping with coordinating and organizing this today. But for the real experts, I want to introduce Brian Hayden, Jeremiah, and Nick. So let's start with Brian.
Hi, Brian Hayden. I'm a solution architect at Concurrency. I've got a long background in the app dev space, worked in quite a few projects here at Concurrency in the identity space. Nick and I have been working with the new Entra SIAM solution probably since about the beginning of the year and when it was in private preview. Nice to meet everybody.
All right, Jeremiah, why don't you go?
Yep, I can go next. I'm Jeremiah Siegel. I'm the technical architect at Concurrency. Same as Brian, been doing app dev for probably around 15 years for me. And Nick is my teammate, and we've been working through Azure B2C and moving on to Entra soon, hopefully.
Yeah, and my name is Nick Woods. We're here in sunny Seattle. I have been in the identity space for about 5 years. I've been kind of specializing a bit in Azure B2C and custom policy development, application integration, all that good stuff. So nice to meet you all. I'm looking forward to talking.
All right, guys. So let's, if you aren't familiar with Concurrency, you should be familiar with us. There's 2 things that you should know. One is that we have capabilities that exist below the line to help prepare your environment to leverage these capabilities, especially identity as it might exist here in your modern workplace or in your infrastructure for your applications. What we're going to be focusing our conversation on today is more about apps and building products with identities. So if you're interested in some of the subjects under here, still stick on. You're going to find this interesting, but we're going to put most of our energy into how you leverage identity to build custom products and bring those to market and where identity is an asset to you there. So Nick, why don't you just start by talking a little bit about what is this Entra thing? Like Microsoft all of a sudden started talking about Entra, like it kind of came out of nowhere. Like what exactly is this?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Entra is kind of more of a rebranding than it actually. So it's a new product family. I guess that's kind of a good way of putting it. So things like things are very familiar to people, like Azure Active Directory, which we will go into more detail about later. So they have that, but Microsoft has also been focusing a lot on like kind of bringing new kind of identity-related products to market. Like, some of the things we'll be talking about later, but things like verified ID, things about like, managed, external identities for customers, things like identity governance. So Entra is just they're kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, these products are related to each other, but like they're not really put together in a coherent way. So this is kind of like a way of branding it together, kind of a way of thinking about it that's new. That's that's a little bit just so that people kind of associate, oh yeah, these are all identity related. These kind of flow together nicely. So yeah, kind of as Nate said earlier, we'll be kind of focusing on kind of this one of the particular product that's an exciting one that's like recently went into public preview called External ID for Customers. It's in public beta now, so most of the things we're talking about now, you can just go out and play with. It just was released into public beta during build, which I guess was about a month and a half ago. So exciting stuff.
Hey, Nathan, just a side note here. I'm not sure if you shared the right screen.
Aha. One moment.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Perfect.
There we go.
There you go. All right. Thank you for that note. Okay. So talk a little bit about what this, I mean, this is a lot of SKU stuff and we're hitting this pretty early, but Nick, what is this?
Yeah, so just kind of, so I don't want to go into the individual SKUs, just kind of want to say one of the big things that's happening as part of this kind of like rebranding is that like the kind of the core product, kind of the flagship product, which is Azure Active Directory, is getting renamed. So kind of the reasons for the rename are that Azure Active Directory was like kind of, one of the earliest, Microsoft cloud offerings, and it was kind of so Microsoft had like an on-premises like identity solution from way back when, kind of like LDAP era, called Active Directory, right? And I think a lot of people are familiar with that. Azure Active Directory has very little to do with Active Directory in terms of how it's structured. It's not hierarchical in the way Active Directory does. It interacts with protocols, a completely different set of protocols as Active Directory. So I think that the name kind of confused a lot of people. So as part of this Entra business, they're just changing the name of Azure Active Directory to Microsoft Entra ID. So one reason we want to kind of mention this is because I think that we're probably still referred to Azure Active Directory or AAD a lot over the course of this talk, just out of habit. Just kind of know that the two are interchangeable, Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Entra ID. And that's going to be kind of the core flagship product. Previously, Entra ID is the employee-centered identity service, right? So like the idea here is like this is kind of your security perimeter, right? So previously Active Directory, the on-premise one was, you managed, who has access to what within your company. Azure Active Directory is doing the same thing, but cloud space in a way that you can kind of in a more modern way, when it interacts with cloud applications in a way that like allows for remote work, right? So that's just kind of a good thing to know. Azure Active Directory and Entra ID are the same thing.
Awesome. And we're focusing most of the next content on this guy right here, Entra External ID.
External ID, which is and External ID is a new product, and we'll kind of go a little more into it with the customer. But Entra ID External ID is going to be customer focused, right? So kind of Entra ID, which is I guess internal ID, is going to be internal to your company. External ID is you create a product offering, you need people to log into it, and this is a tool that you can use in order to do that. Alrighty, and then just kind of this a little kind of to reiterate something we said earlier. This is not the only Entra product, right? So we have Azure Active Directory, which is external, which is Azure Entra ID now. But you also have permissions management, which is kind of the you have easy ways of assigning people to things. There's a VerifID, which we'll talk about later. And you have all these other good products that Entra encompasses.
So let's talk a little bit about B2C, Nick. Like this is something that has been both wonderful and challenging for a long time. Let's just talk about the history.
Yeah, so totally. I have a very intimate relationship with B2C, so I think I can tell you about it a little bit. So B2C is a previous. So the reason B2C is important here is because Microsoft already had a consumer-focused identity offering, right? Which is Azure Directory B2C, right? And B2C is great in a lot of ways, but there's also some challenges with it, right? So kind of we want to talk about what's good about it, what's worth preserving, and why there's a new, but also like, if there's all these great things about it, like why are they coming up with a new product? So let's kind of start with the good first. So kind of in general, right? So the idea here is that say you're creating a application that's, the conventional, consumer focused, conventional way of, managing identities is you would do it yourself, right? You would email, maybe set up a table in a database, you would hash and install your password yourself, maybe with the help of a little software package. And that's, okay in many ways, but, there's one of the big problem is that it kind of opens yourself up to all sorts of security issues. So you don't want that responsibility of having to manage your own identity. It's just not like, it's outside of the business logic of your thing. It's just not in the business that most people are trying to do. So B2C is kind of coming along and saying, hey, we'll manage all that for you. We'll store the identities. We'll make sure they stay safe, right? We'll help you prevent data breaches. And you're going to use these kind of modern authentication protocols, OIDC, SAML, all that, to help you kind of have your, we stand up a separate application to handle identity, and then your application interacts with them using these modern secure identity protocols. And then you also get kind of a lot of extra benefits if you do that, right? So one of the big things that's, it's called single sign-on, right? So say you have two different applications, right? So you have two different consumer-focused applications. One that's maybe one that allows you to buy widgets, and once you bought a widget, you have a different application that allows you to service your widget, right? So the user can use one set of credentials for both applications really easily. User can log into one and then automatically be logged into the other one, because even if they're entirely different domains, URLs, what have you. So this is a really beneficial to a lot of users. It allows you to completely re-architect your application in a way that makes a whole lot more sense, a way that's more modular. It also kind of comes with all these features. It comes with multi-factor authentication, right? So when you get a SMS message for confirming your after you log in, right, as an extra layer of security. You have integration with third-party APIs, right? So you can call APIs during your login flow. You can do things like social login, right? So people can log in with their Google account. People can log in with their LinkedIn account. People can log in with their WeChat account. And you can also, and B2C is also pretty inexpensive, right? So there are other, competitors out there that, can do something really similar, but B2C had to beat with the price, which a lot of customers, especially enterprise customers, really liked.
I'll add here to just pause here on the good, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from my perspective and experience working with clients on B2C, one of the benefits, if you're okay with the out-of-the-box way that B2C is implemented and you're using standard user flows, it's actually pretty easy to use, right? And so from that standpoint, it can be a fairly pleasant experience, and you get the features like the MFA and localization and the social logins. Those are all just check boxes that you can click or things that you can do within the portal. And then I don't know, we kind of glossed over the low cost, but it's free, right? So B2C is essentially free if you're under 50,000. I think that's the number, 50,000 users within a month, and you aren't doing MFA, because they do charge for your MFA transactions. But it can be an extraordinarily cheap way for you to implement identity within the organization, and that's always been one of the key benefits for for the customers that we talk to about that. Now the bad.
Okay, now the bad. Yeah. All right. Yeah. They did the cheapest. You had to get lots and lots. You had to be really active in order for B2C to start costing real money. So the main bad thing with the B2C is, so Hayden made a really good point, which is that if you're doing something pretty simple, then B2C is really easy to use. But once you kind of start, it has two modes, right? It has things called user flows, which are, really straightforward, right? But then if you need to do something a little more complicated, you have to use these things called custom policies. And custom policy is a very, it's XML. right? And it's a very complicated XML schema. And it does a lot of stuff, right? But like most people don't want to be managing like 5,000 line XML files. They get very hairy very quickly. Has like these like different levels of abstraction that you have to learn about that like don't really apply to anything else that a lot of developers haven't really seen before, right? Like, I've had, so a big, kind of, so this kind of causes a lot of issues with, companies that try to implement this. One of them is that like you can't really onboard developers very easily. It takes a while to learn these things. Done training sessions and with them, and so even it takes a while to kind of grok it, right? Like you tell people what a validation technical profile is, and they kind of heads start spinning a little bit. Not that it can't be done, right? But like it's just a lot of time and effort required for developing what is a pretty niche skill set. It's like got a big reason why I have a job, right? So we end up kind of bringing consultants in like me that kind of know how to set these things up. So like another big thing is that like page customization, right? So like in B2C, right? The custom policies offer a really high degree of customization of your flow, right? Of like the look and feel. You can even add like custom JavaScript to these things to do things like password, um, like little password indicators, things like that. There are a lot of, so that kind of opens up a lot of possibility, but it can be very difficult to do. You kind of end up like fighting with Microsoft's custom JavaScript a little bit, and like it ends up being kind of weird, and you have to be very careful with it. So it's difficult. So you have, the out of the box flows that Hayden was talking about, those user flows, like they're very easy to do, but they don't handle a lot of use cases. So you end up having to jump to these like high complexity custom policies for, pretty quickly. Um, another big point with B2C is that it has distance from the AED, I guess what's now ID. So B2C is like, it's called Azure Active Directory B2C, and it's like kind of the base of it is a fork of AED, but it has like an extra layer of has an extra like software layer like on top of it, and a lot of things have to go through that software. As a result, like there's kind of a little bit of feature drift, right? So Microsoft works on these cool new features for Azure Active Directory, right? Or I guess Entra ID, the employee-focused offering. But because there's like these like extra layer of software, these extra software, this stuff sitting in the middle, it ends up being difficult for Microsoft to like roll out new features for B2C that have already been added to AAD, even if they're, if they make a lot of sense in the consumer context. So we'll kind of cover some of those things that have been, added to B2C late, or kind of in a way that's a little difficult to like implement. End up being, or we'll see those kind of come up again when we talk about the external ID for customers.
I'll also add and jump in here too. So a conversation that I have with customers when working with B2C often is delineating the differences between authentication and authorization. And while B2C handles the authentication portion, like I am who I say I am, really well, it doesn't handle what can I do, and what permissions do I have very well. So that's always kind of a sticky point with implementations. Jeremiah, anything else you would add to this?
No, I think that Nick kind of covered it, the complexity from the developers. Like having to read XML in general is not something the developers are used to, and you find yourself kind of tracing back and forth when you're working with B2C, because those policies are all XML, and sometimes they can, as the complexity goes, they can, it's just a lot to go through from the step point, because there are when you take one path, and it's not just flowing down the custom policy, you could be taking multiple paths depending upon logic you may have added. So yeah, that's difficult for some developers to get used to and understand in general. It's not just following it through and reading XML, it's understanding what is it doing, what are particular attributes, and like validation profiles, like what is that, what can you do with it. It is kind of its own little ecosystem.
Yeah, there's like a lot of layers of abstraction kind of built into these XML policies that like developers need to wrap their heads around.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things I've experienced with B2C in particular is it's a really difficult skill set to get someone to grow as part of their core competency, because it doesn't neatly fit into one of the main buckets. Like a guy who's kind of been the person who's traditionally been like an infrastructure really struggles with, they might get identity, but they might struggle with like the development pieces of it. And a developer struggles to kind of drop down into some things that are kind of like infrastructure skills, and finding a person that kind of wants to live in that space is difficult, because the developers want to build the rocket ship, the infrastructure guy doesn't have the skill, so you're like finding people that can kind of fit there, and that's been really challenging from just a skill development standpoint with this current skill set, this current tool set.
100% agree.
So to solve all that, we enter external identities. What is this, Nick?
Yeah, okay, cool. So enter external identities, and just when public preview is a new consumer-focused identity offering like B2C. Now, before I go too far into it, I just kind of want to make sure that like anyone who's like currently using B2C, there are no plans to deprecate B2C anytime soon. So if you're currently using, so if you're like, have a new project and you're thinking about using B2C, this is like, you probably thinking again, this is like something you should weigh. But like if you're currently using B2C, no need to panic yet. But what this is, right, is it's going to be a new, so some of the cool things about external identities is that, first of all, it's going to, so it's signed through apps, right? So again, pretty much most of the cool features that we talk about, or in terms of the good things about B2C, are all here, right? You still have your consumer focused identities, you still have SSO, you still have MFA, you still have all these like different cool authentication methods you can use, social login, all that, federation, all that good stuff. So we'll go deeper into these individual features later. So one of the really like top level things I want to mention about it is that it's much closer to vanilla employee focused AAD or like employee focused Entra ID. So it doesn't have this extra software layer. So a lot of the features are going to be a lot more similar to the things that you're used to. So if you've used Entra ID, AAD before, this is going to look very familiar to you. But it's but we're slowly kind of building these like core consumer focused features directly into that service. Yeah, cool. So kind of a very high overview. Okay, what does all that mean? What is all this about? So what's actually part of Entra external identity? So it's a directory, right? So the big part of it is the fact that it actually stores, identities. It stores consumer-focused identities, and these are going to be a little bit different from AAD, and I keep wanting to call it internal ID, but Entra ID identities, right? So it's just, they're going to be, users with arbitrary email addresses, arbitrary, different, the flexibility of sign-in method is like a pretty big difference between, Entra ID, which is, AAD, right? So like, if you're your employee, you're on board with them, you can tell them how to sign in, right? When it comes to that, right? Whereas like when we have a consumer focused app, you need a lot more flexibility. So like kind of the directory changes kind of are there to reflect that. And we'll go too far into that. But so it provides the flexibility that you need in terms of having a consumer focused app. Has application registrations, right? So it provides a mechanism for you to kind of talk, say, okay, what are the different applications using this? All the different they'll be able to, SSO with each other. You'll be able to log into one, and log to the other one. User flows. So this is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. Hayden was saying that like the user flows in B2C are like really easy to use. So if you like those, I have great news for you. So Entra's external identity, like for customers, is going to be mostly focused on beefing up those user flows. It's going to be kind of taking that and then adding features to it, that like replicates some of the B2C features, but in a way that's a lot more user friendly, a lot more developer friendly, a lot easier to get up and running with. Don't require you to learn all this crazy XML stuff. And one of the features that kind of build on top of these user flows, one of the ways that they allow you to do this is extensions, which we'll talk about later. But just on a very high level, extensions are like a way of calling APIs in the middle of a flow, right? So you can kind of stand up your own little function app that goes and does other stuff. So you're programming, you're not just doing XML, right? So programmers are probably going to be a lot more familiar with that. I have a couple slides about it later, kind of screenshots of like what exactly that entails, but it's a very good addition here. Cool. And then sign-in methods. Yeah, so it's going to be so you still have all that MFA. You have all your one-time passwords, right? And this is still active development here. But yeah, like things like Windows Hello, things like YubiKeys, they're all kind of in active development. Like, so this is all like things, pretty much everything you expect out of a modern security solution. All the different ways of like proving that you are who you say you are going to be included. And then finally, kind of just real quick, encryption keys. Not going to go too far into it, but like this is going to be all the different ways of like your application. You need a bunch of encryption keys in order for your application to kind of communicate with the identity provider, for everyone kind of trust each other, right? Kind of establishing something, being an external ID is going to, like B2C, is going to provide a very easy, user-friendly way of establishing, kind of putting in those keys so that your applications can trust each other.
So before we get to going through any of the screenshots and showing what it looks like, we made a big deal out of like B2C being complicated, difficult to onboard into. What can I do easily in Entra that I couldn't do easily before?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's go ahead. Yeah, I'll kind of go through these one by one. So the big thing is like you just stand up and sign in flow, like user flow very easily, right? So this is something that you could have done in B2C using these user flows, but again, kind of that like establishing the base, like kind of is in Entra is a lot easier. You can once you establish this sign-in flow, you can kind of treat that. You can kind of add things to it, and you can modify it in different ways that are, whereas in ways that like in B2C require this like jump to these custom policies. Another good thing, one example of that is add sign in with social identities. Which is so single sign-in. So like you can go ahead and add like your social identities and SAML, in fact. So like pretty much what we call an identity federation, right? You can go ahead and grab someone has the existing identity, right? So if someone like already has a B2C, sorry, not B2C. If someone has like a Facebook account, someone has a Google account, you can like the user can use those to sign in, and that's something that can just be plopped down in user flow really easily. So we do have a question real quick. I can go ahead and answer that if that's okay. So it's asking, is there a graph database that can be used for reporting, dashboard users, et cetera, similar to what there is for an AAD? Yeah, so good news there. It's going to be the same. So like in terms of like the graph API that AAD surfaces, that's also going to be available for external identity, because external identity is at its core AAD, right? So that's all the same. I don't want to say exactly this, right? All the same, because there might be some like minor like API modifications, but yeah, all that's also going to be available in external identities. Kind of the same as what was available in B2C. Now, in terms of like, I don't have like a public preview, so like I don't know exactly how the details are going to be, but they're definitely going to surface a lot of those identities. And they're also one of the things I heard but I don't have a whole lot of details about is that they are also working on a lot of like reporting things to kind of, so if you don't want to like dig into, the Graph API, there'll be like more reporting, dashboarding mechanisms that you can use a little bit more directly. Does that make sense? All right, cool. Yeah, beautiful. All right, so going back to the things that are easy to do. So I'm going to use 3 and 4 together. So 3 is like add company branding to your sign-up page, and 4 is easily customize your sign-up flows. So customization kind of takes a step in these user flows, definitely takes a step further than the user flows in B2C. So B2C had the company branding, but like one thing, extra cool things you can do in Entra external identities is add CSS, right? So you kind of start off with a page. You can start off with a page that looks a lot like logging into AAD, but you can customize it however you want. But like, you do a lot once you start with the CSS, right? You can move things around. CSS it can be very robust, right? So one the kind of the big thing that I think is like between the difference between user flows and I don't have a lot of slides regarding this, but I just want to mention it real quick. But big flows with B2C user flows and Entra user flows is language support. B2C has language support, but it's via the custom policies, and it's very difficult to implement. One of the Entra kind of does this one way simpler way, much more intuitive way. You can just kind of go directly into the portal and create things. Alrighty. And the last thing is kind of providing self-service account management, which, okay, right? So B2C, if you want like any sort of account management, you have to kind of spin it up yourself. Entra kind of, for a lot of that comes out of the box. Alrighty, cool. All right, so we got a lot of screenshots here, but for kind of things we want to start off with is kind of these user flows, right? So the user flows are kind of be the foundational to Entra external identities. So one thing I want to mention, so if you're familiar with B2C, then then one of the major differences between the way the Entra user flows work and the way that they work in B2C is that the Entra user flows are going to be tied to specific applications. So that doesn't mean the applications still won't be able to like talk to each other. And that like a lot of things that you're adding, kind of the components you're using are going to be like, a little bit modular. So you can bring them into multiple user flows. But like adding a user flow is really easy, and like user flow is going to be kind of a way of customizing things like, your claims and things, right? So for example, creating user flow, right now, they only have so if you go into the public preview, because it's still a public preview, you can only create a sign up signing user flow. Like they're going to add a whole bunch more. So one of the things that, so kind of what the screenshot is showing is you can add, adding like Google and Facebook, like there's a little bit of configuration there, but like it's kind of just like you're saying you want to use it. It's just kind of a click of a button. User attributes are just ways of, you can say what information you want to collect from the user during the sign-up flow. And you can even add your own custom bits of information, like say, like you want to get like, what university you went to, or like what, product family you're interested in, things like that. If we move on to the next slide, right? So this is kind of talking a little bit more about those user attributes, right? You can collect pretty much whatever you want during the sign-up flow. And it's pretty straightforward doing that. So once you do that, you'll have like a little user flow that you can, and then once you hit create here, you're pretty much done, right? You can add more stuff to it later, but you have a complete user flow that you can interact with. You can use to like interact with your application, which is really cool.
And Nick, comparing that to Azure B2C, is that the similar experience? How is this different?
Yeah, this is pretty similar experience to B2C. This is similar to the user flow experience to B2C.
Yeah.
It is way, way easier than the XML experience to B2C.
Mhm.
right? This would take like, it would take me like a day to set up, whereas this is like a 5 minute thing, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, it's kind of, you know, like, so if you want to do with something a bit more complicated, this is a pretty substantial time savings.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's worth noting. Just the comparison between the two. It seems like kind of boilerplate from what a developer might be used to, especially working with Azure.
Yeah,
But in B2C, that isn't the experience. It's just kind
exactly. Yeah,
Mhm.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's bringing this. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This is like definitely bringing like identity way more in line with the experience of like other Azure products, you know.
Yeah, you look at it
Um,
and you're like, oh, this is kind of simple. This is about what you
yeah.
want, right? And you're like, well, good, because B2C
Yeah,
didn't work that way.
exactly. Yeah, you kind of need the battle scars to understand how great this is in a certain way. Yeah, there aren't any validation technical trials involved in here. No content definitions. Yeah. Cool. So one thing
Let's
I
talk
kind of want to
conditional
touch on,
access.
yeah, conditional access. So this is important. So conditional access is kind of, I think, a little bit of a vague term, but this is really important because um, this is how MFA is handled uh, in external identities. Not just MFA, but like it's a kind of a much larger feature. And it's a fairly robust feature and it's something they keep adding to. Now there was just something like this in B2C, but again, and this was like, you know, it was managed in the portal, but again, you had to do like this extra policy XML stuff in order to get it to work. And I remember that this in particular being very, very finicky in B2C is I found it I was doing custom policies for years and I had a hard time getting it to work even with like all the custom, you know, sampling, all the sample stuff. But in external identities, it's way easier. You just kind of set it and forget it, or you don't have to forget it. But kind of, you know, some of the things that you can do with it are, I guess, like kind of taking a step back, what it is in the first place. So the idea here is that you want to kind of, you know, modify kind of the conditional is the conditional access is kind of the key thing is like based on like, you know, certain conditions, like for example, here we have like device platforms. So if they're using like a Windows machine or iOS, but like also like you can set them specific users, set specific security groups, which is kind of going back on what Hayden says. So like that's a second, or specific IP addresses or ranges, parts of the world that the user is coming from. You can say that like, hey, we don't want this user to log in at all. We want to block them. We want to make sure that we don't want to block them, but like we want these users to use MFA, but we want these other users to not use MFA. Um, so like there's all sorts of different like things you can do. You can kind of like chop up your user base and kind of say, okay, these users are like a little, you know, we have algorithm, we can determine that these users are a little riskier than others, and we kind of, you know, want to make sure they use MFA, whereas these other users, right, we don't want to drive them away. We don't want them to have to go through an extra step in order to log in. Because like another big thing that people talk about is friction, right? Like you don't, the longer your authentication, no one wants to be authenticated, right? Like you want to be getting into the business app, and the longer the authentication process is, there, the more attrition you're going to have, the more people are going to kind of get frustrated and just leave. So this is conditional access is like a really good way of balancing that. It's a really, it's a way of kind of making the authentication process as quick and painless as possible for as many people as possible while making sure that your app stays secure. So kind of going a little bit more into like sign and rest. So like one of the kind of the conditions they use, and one of the really important ones, kind of let's go to talk a little bit about two particular conditions, one of which is kind of sign in risk, right? So one of the conditions you can use is actually like kind of like machine learning, like Microsoft algorithmically generated. They do something kind of like, you know, like the reCAPTCHA, like the version 3, not the one where you have to like choose the crosswalks or whatever, but just like, you know, kind of it just runs the background and Microsoft determines, okay, looks at all sorts of things about the user's browser and tries to see, okay, is this secure or not? If not, if it's like, you know, if the algorithm feels pretty comfortable with the user, they can make sure you just pass them through. If not, we can require MFA. So there's all sorts of conditions you can use. You can set up your own special security groups to like kind of usher people through. Like, you're just like, if one person, have one particular user, you don't want them to ever have to do MFA, you just turn it off for them. There's like, yeah, so the fact that it's like conditional, the fact that you have all these like tools available to you, and the fact that Microsoft always kind of adding more is like a very potent way of managing your identity flows. And kind of moving to the next, actually, again, am going back to one sec? Sorry. Yeah, and then kind of, yeah, so this is just showing you what you can do, right? So like you can require multi-factor authentication, right? You can require password changes, things like that. So all sorts of really good stuff you can do with this. It's a very powerful feature. Alrighty, cool. Another core feature, and this is entirely new to external identities. Again, this is something you could do with B2C, but you can only do it with custom policies. So this is new to the user flow experience. This is this thing called custom extensions. And I think this is a fairly core selling point, a fairly core reason why you would want to use external IDs over B2C. Again, B2C, right, you have you can add API calls in the middle of a flow. And this is kind of letting you do that. But instead of just like, slotting into like a, custom policy, instead, Microsoft is kind of providing you specific like events, right? So specific things that happen during the sign-in flow, right? Right now in the public preview, they give you one event to play with, but they've said that they're going to add way more. This is just the start. So the one that they have added so far is token issuance start. So the token is just the way that the identity, what we call the identity provider, so like the external ID, right? So that's one application. You can think of that as one application. You can think of your actual consumer application another, right? And once the user is done logging in, your identity provider is going to send a token over to your consumer. It's going to be signed, so make sure, which adds layer security, but it also adds a bunch of things called claims, which claims is just a fancy identity word for variables. So this token issuance start, right, calls an external API that you create, that you spin up. And first of all, if you want something to happen at the end of the flow, right, the API can kind of manage that. It's code, you can do whatever you want with it. But it also can go ahead and just like grab more claims to be passed back to your application. Say that you have like a consumer, right? Because say that you have like a consumer application that's like managed by a bank, right? And you want to like go and grab that user's like bank account number or something like that. You probably won't actually want to do that, but that's just an example, right? Like you don't really want to store that in an identity solution. It doesn't have anything to do with who the user is, but it's like an important bit of information the application needs to know, right? So you can spin up an API that does that for you. And the important thing I kind of want to like emphasize here, kind of in the, you can do the next slide if you want. Is it's way easier to set this up in B2C, right? It kind of does a lot of this flow kind of does a lot of the hard work for you. So here we have to have like API authentication, right? So the way this normally happens is you need to create like a separate app registration for your API. This flow does that for you, right? So it's like removing a lot of steps. So just removes a lot of steps, makes this process as painless as possible. Obviously, if your application is a little bit weird, you'll have to do a little bit more finagling with the app registration, but all that's still available to you. And because it's like most of the time you're going to be spinning up like a Azure function in order to do this, it's just there's the integration there is like really much tighter than it is in B2C. Cool. Alrighty. So a couple more things we want to talk about. Federation. So this is what we were talking about earlier, right? So like your consumer, in the consumer space especially, like your users' identities aren't always going to be stored in the directory, right? So like external ID has a directory, you're grabbing identities from it, and that's a very core feature. But like say that like we talked a little about social identity, right? Social login. If you don't necessarily want to use an identity that's like in that data in your own kind of directory store, you want to go and grab an identity from Facebook, you want to grab one from Google, or say that like you have an application that's like available to both consumers and employees. You want employees to be able to log into it. What you can do is you can federate within another identity provider. You can go to your Active Directory or your internal ID application, right? And you can go grab that. They've already added. They're already working on SAML federation, right? So SAML is a very core identity. Is so like anything that speaks this SAML, anything so things like AAD, right? You can create a SAML application there, so you can already go and grab identities from AAD or Entra ID, which it kind of opens up a lot of doors to you. Allows this to be kind of a central way that so just you don't have to do any extra finagling in your application. You just let an external ID handle that. You don't need to set up multiple identity providers. It makes things a lot easier when you're trying to integrate with your application. And this is something that B2C added, but it added fairly late. So, and this is about the fact that Entra is going to have this out of the gate and also B2C, again, in order to use SAML, you have to use custom policies, which huge headache. And this kind of adding just having a nice little boilerplate is really good. A huge improvement in terms of experience.
Yeah, I think that we were talking to a customer, and I don't remember the exact words he said, but he said something to the tune of yeah, we used Azure AD B2C, and it was a horrible experience. Mm-hmm. Not because it didn't work, but because of the challenge in getting it to do what they wanted to do. And this is just kind of another example of where they're making a lot of this very easy to apply.
Yeah. So a lot of this is very directly based on kind of that consumer feedback. Or kind of their B2C. Microsoft was kind of heard this is B2C is great, but it's really complicated. And we don't know how to use it. We don't know how to manage these custom policies in the future, right? You bring in a contractor to build them, but what if you need to change them, right? And this is making all that way easier. Okay, cool. So I want to talk a little bit about application integration. One thing's just because it's a thing that's not changing, right? And it's but this, the reason I want to bring this up is because there will be obviously a lot of migration work in terms of the identity provider, right? But in terms of integrating your app, it's not going to be, if you're already using B2C, it's not going to be nearly as much of that. It's not going to be a huge headache on that side, right? So if you're not using it, right, this is a good thing to notice. Microsoft has this cool package called MCell, right? And MCell kind of works with a lot of different, very popular technologies. So if your app's written in any Angular or Node or Python or Java, this is good. It's it's not just so it's it extends way beyond the .NET ecosystem is what we want to say. So yeah, just really briefly, if you have any questions, so this can be kind of a sticking point for a lot of people. If you're already using B2C, this is going to be very similar.
Awesome. All right, so this is sort of an adjacent technology, but what the heck does it mean to have a verified ID, Nick?
Yeah, okay. So verified ID is this really cool thing. And kind of when I talk to people about it, or kind of a little bit technical background, I kind of thinking about, HTTPS, right? Everyone knows a while later, your start with HTTP, but now they start with HTTPS, right? And what that means is that there's this, certificate, right? Kind of, we talked about these identification protocols, right? So you're using these certificates to say who you are, right? So we have this ecosystem of these companies now verifying, okay, when sites go over the internet, they're encrypted in a certain way and they're signed in a certain way so that the end user knows that things aren't tampered with, right? So what so what verified ID is kind of doing is kind of taking that application, taking that idea and expanding it to way beyond just websites, right? Say that you have like a driver's license, or say that you have, you know, credential, or say that you like, you know, went past a Microsoft exam, right? How do you verify the fact that you've done this? And the idea here is that you know, an organization, you know, a document can be backed by an organization, and they can like attach, you know, a signature to that, and just kind of say that, okay, this is, you know, as an organization, I vouch for this. You know, as a degree granting institution, I can guarantee that you got this master's degree or whatever, right? So the idea here is that it's like, this is much, much easier than, you know, calling up the University of, you know, Southwestern Washington State and saying, hey, did you get this? And they say, yep, right. No, all you can do is call up this user's, you know, public key and verify it, right? You don't have to do any extra steps. And it's entirely, and it's like, has the same like level of security that we used to in all these like very sensitive identity topics. So this has a lot of really cool applications, right? So it's fast, right? Kind of talk about it. It's secure. Things like account recovery are really easy because like you don't have to go through extra steps. You don't have to like, it kind of takes out there's a certain like level of human equation, right? Where like, you know, say that someone lost their password, right? You know, someone at the company has to verify that. You don't really have to do that anymore because they can just grant use like certificate-based auth instead. It's like all sorts of really cool applications. And another really nice thing about this is that it can be done and is being done in a way that like is very easy for the end user to verify stuff. It's very easy for the end user to use.
Yeah, one thing I thought was really neat about it is like already when you go to like I go to Packer games, right? Like already when I go to a Packer game, you have to like they did away with the physical ticket. It's a digital ticket. I put it in my wallet on my iPhone, open it up, and they scan it, right? Same kind of idea here, right? That like I work at concurrency or I have a degree from Marquette or whatever it is something that becomes a digital record that walks with you and is already verified. So like if you're trying to look at something like I'm verified to run a forklift or an LTL for a trucker, or I'm a certified financial analyst. Like these are things that allow us to onboard, de-onboard, gig economy, or whatever faster than what we had done before.
Yeah, totally. It's very, very exciting.
So this is something you can look to integrate into your different types of end user facing applications, or as you think about identity in the context of like your employees. So two different kind of angles on that. And this will be something that we'll explore in the future and something we'd love to talk to you about. So many use cases for this. As like most of this presentation has been like, well, duh, like that's like how an identity system should work. And it's like, seems pretty easy. This is where you're like taking it that next notch of like making identity an asset to the organization to drive efficiency, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, totally. Kind of adding to that, like it's like think of the Entra ID is like the external ID is like stuff that like seems obvious now, but like kind of when B2C is, you know, they're putting together B2C, like it's like you're kind of taking those Microsoft is taking those lessons that like we're learning through B2C and kind of putting it together. But this is like an entirely new thing. This is like, yeah, this is something that like, you know, can drive a lot of new value, I think.
Exactly. Awesome. All right. So in terms of how to carry forward from here, we do have some suggestions. What we would love to do is to continue this education process with you. I'm sure you have tons of questions that we didn't cover today, like how do I convert from B2C to Entra? External identities. What does that conversion look like? Or how do I apply verified credentials into my end user or internal identity conversation? Like how does that process look? That's where we can provide some additional education to your team. We love to do that in small groups or in groups like this. Happy to cover a lot of the same content or new content. So just simply providing additional education is something we really believe in and are happy to do as part of building a relationship with a company. So that's sort of thing one. Thing two is if you have an existing application that has an identity platform, especially if you're using B2C now and you need to know how it's going to move to Entra, external identities, or if you have another identity platform and you're looking at using something like Entra, let's have that conversation and let's open up what the existing application is doing today, how you're securing the identities and how you can move it to a new platform, what those next steps would look like. And then finally, one thing we do all the time is just greater app modernization strategies. So if identity is just a piece of what modernizing your application needs to look like, and you need someone to look at the bigger picture, absolutely pull on us to be able to have that conversation. Many of these are areas where there's even programs we can pull on to help have those conversations. So let's talk. Either one of these, pull the trigger, let's have a conversation about it. And we love to dig into education, talking about where the development of your particular app goes, or even talking about its entire app strategy and driving into how you modernize it either to the cloud or into a collection of different places. So thank you for taking time with us today. Hopefully this is something that's really giving you some exposure to where the Microsoft ecosystem is going with its identity platform, what the heck Entra is, and what are some game-changing things happening with decentralized identity. And we're looking forward to talking more with you in the future. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.